Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today we have the pleasure of our HR series webinar, Class and Comp Dilemma. Will job seekers and job openings meet in a post-pandemic marketplace? And today, Igor and Michelle are going to go over and discuss what types of compensation and classification practices do we really need to look at to address post-COVID realities. The presenters, Igor Shegelev and Michelle Garbato. Hopefully, Igor, I didn't mess up your name there. They're both classification and compensation experts at CPS HR Consulting. The session will be recorded, and I will post a link to the recording on the webinar page of our website. It'll also be available in our resource library. So if you're looking up for anything class and comp related, it will show up there, and we'll have a copy of the slides as well if you need them. In order to ensure a high quality recording, all attendees are in listen only mode. And if you do have questions for Igor or Michelle, please put them in the Q&A or the comments, and I will moderate those as they come up. I know sometimes it's a little bit hard to look at Q&A when you're presenting items. And with that, let's get started. Igor or Michelle?
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
As Jason mentioned, I'm Michelle Garbato. I'm a principal HR consultant at CPS HR Consulting. Prior to working at CPS, I worked for state and local government agencies in California. So I've held a lot of HR leadership positions, over 12 years experience in HR. As Jason mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Igor Shegelev. Igor, do you want to say hello and give a brief background of your experience?
Yes, hi. My name is Igor Shegelev, and I am technical advisor with CPS HR. And prior to joining CPS HR, I was holding management and executive jobs in compensation and classification and human resources in both private and public arena. And I also taught business college and compensation topics at the graduate level at the university. I'll be very glad to participate in this webinar with Michelle.
Thanks, Igor. Now we can go to the next slide and really jump into the slides and what we're going to go over today. I do want to say I'm going to put myself off video just because I've been having technical difficulties with my internet and I don't want to get kicked off of the webinar. So I do apologize in advance. So America's back to work, but not fully and not readily. So over the last 2 years or so, our economy has obviously had a huge transition. We've seen unemployment skyrocket, business closures, layoffs. We've seen the biggest experiment of working remotely to date. And over the past months, we're seeing the transition back into the workplace. So job openings are exploding. People are physically coming back to the office. And we're seeing employees have transitioned back into the workforce. So with this, we're seeing some interesting trends occurring. Some employees are quitting and not returning to the workplace. Some employees are not returning enthusiastically or as readily. So we're seeing these trends and patterns happen, and we're seeing them show up in unemployment with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So as you can see on the learning objective slide, what we're going to talk about today is really a multitude of items, from changes in the labor economics and wage inflation and the composition of the workforce, as well as HR challenges too. We're also going to provide you with some practical solutions. So we want you to walk away with some practical solutions that you can put in HR in your organization. So really the goal of this webinar is to start the conversation about what HR professionals can do and should be thinking about to help bridge the gap between the job seekers and job openings. So on the next slide, we'll talk about post-COVID and the state of labor and challenges. So what does it look like? Well, back in July and August, when Igor and I first started preparing for this webinar, there was approximately the same number of job seekers to job openings. So roughly 10 million job openings to 10 million job seekers. Since the end of August, we're seeing the number of job seekers softening a bit in the market to approximately 8 million people, but the number of job openings has slightly increased to approximately 10.4 million. So what does this all mean? If the number of job seekers and the number of job openings are equivalent, we should be all set, right? So those job seekers can just fill those job openings. But as we know, if only it were that simple, the needs of the openings might be different from the skills of the job seekers. So what can we do as HR practitioners to help bridge this gap? We'll talk about this in a bit as we talk more about the state of post-COVID labor marketplace on the next slide. So what is the state of the post-COVID labor market? The trend we're seeing is that there are obviously more job openings and more job seekers, as we already discussed, but we're also seeing that wage inflation has been the highest it has been in the last 40 years. The pandemic also prompted workers to retire, and it has sparked a lot of employees to be reluctant to come back to work. I'm seeing articles termed on the Great Resignation, as they're now calling it, where employees are quitting as they don't want to return to the office or to their old jobs. We're also seeing a disproportionate industrial growth, where some industries are shrinking and some are expanding. So what do we mean? For example, we see that retail industry is shrinking because web sales are increasing. People from retail are going to different industries. We also see that blue collar is decreasing, and we actually have a slide that really dives into the blue collar workforce a little later in this presentation. And then we're also seeing that transportation and material goods industries are expanding. So all these changes are obviously changing the composition of the workforce. So on top of this, we're seeing a lagging response on these fronts from HR to help address these changes. So on the next slide, we have a nice chart that shows the difference in job seekers and job openings over the last 10 years. So this slide is really impactful and really drives the point home of just how much change we've had in COVID in comparison to the last 10 years. So if you look at 2010 on the left side of the chart, after the 2008 recession, we can see that there was roughly 14 million job seekers back then, and that's that orange line that you see there. But there were only 3.5 million openings during that same time period, which is the blue line. As you can see, we've had low unemployment from 2017 to 2019. And then COVID hit. And then in the period of June 2020, we see the number of job seekers far surpassing the number of job openings. So it was roughly 18 million job seekers and only 6 million job openings during the height of COVID. But again, now we're seeing them kind of meet in the middle, where it's more approximate, where it's around 10 million job seekers to job openings roughly. And we're seeing that softening a bit, but meeting more so. So what does this look like in terms of payroll? We'll talk about that on the next slide here. So here we see how job employment has changed from COVID, and we look at the cost of payroll. So we're seeing the difference in payroll gains and losses from February 2020 to July 2021. This is data from World at Work. So as you can see in the yellow, Idaho and Utah had above 0% of gains for payroll costs, meaning they had an increase in the payroll costs and were expanding, while all of the other states in the US had up to 7% decreases in their payroll costs during that same time period. So why is this? Well, our research showed that Idaho is a small agricultural state, and they were really as much hit by COVID during the pandemic. And Utah wasn't really hit as much either. Our research showed that Utah did better in testing. The population is younger and healthier than the national average, which kind of reduced the likelihood that they had pre-existing conditions. So that's kind of why they were expanding and weren't as hard hit as other US states. So on the next slide, we'll talk about the blue collar workforce in more detail. So this slide from Bloomberg shows how the blue collar workforce aging population is shrinking, and there's a deficiency and mismatch in skills needed. So the total number of blue collar workforce is decreasing year over year, as you can see in the gray bars there. So we look at the growth as 3% by 2% by 1% year over year. So why is this? The answer is because the number of jobs in blue collar don't require a degree is decreasing, and the number of jobs that actually require that bachelor's degree are increasing. You see this on the blue bars. So you can see the rise from 11% to 12%. So as these increase, they may roll over towards professional level jobs or management as they require higher degrees. So we're seeing kind of a trend where blue collar jobs are becoming more technical and they're kind of ceasing to become blue collar anymore. So take for an example, an air conditioning mechanic. Let's say once you're an air conditioning mechanic, you go to school and get additional schooling, and then you become an AI operator or an engineer. Well, now you have more skills, you're likely to be paid more. And this isn't necessarily a bad trend that we're seeing with the blue collar workforce. Think about over the last 40 years, the US has lost many manufacturing jobs because we have more advanced technology and automation now. But the bad news is if you're waiting for an AC repairman in the middle of summer, just know that things are really going to start to heat up quickly, as you'll likely be waiting longer and paying more for their services because the supply is going down. On the next slide, we'll discuss the operations disrupted by COVID. So now we're looking at a study completed by McKinsey & Company of what occupations were most disrupted by COVID. So this was completed on a 100-point scale. So you'll see the top industries that were affected by COVID and their respective scores. So occupations such as medical care, personal care, retail stores and banks, and restaurants were hit the hardest. And this isn't surprising, right? Because they had the highest physical proximity. Based on their human interactions and work environment, they were closest to other people on the job, and therefore were disrupted the most. These areas will also see the greatest transformations as they look at their business models as a response to COVID. And we'll see higher growth in these areas as well. On the next slide, we'll talk about how local and state government has been impacted. So the Mission Square Research Institute State and Local Government Workforce Survey actually surveyed 288 US cities to see what industries that were having the hardest time filling positions in local and state government. So this study showed that nursing, skilled trades, and police were the hardest to fill job industries, which isn't surprising given COVID and all the other items we're seeing in the economy, right? But again, we see that retirement eligible workers accelerated their retirement in 2020, where literally tripled the percent of retirements that occurred in 2009. So these are pretty significant trends that we're seeing and we want to pay attention to. Government agencies should look at these areas and really target the hard to fill positions. And they should look at revisiting the concept and classification plan and prepare appropriately. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. We're going to go on to the next slide, which focuses on highest job growth statistics. So this slide is data from the US Department of Labor, and again shows industries with the highest job growth. And here we see again that healthcare, food prep, and serving related occupations had the most job growth projected for the 2019 to 2029 period. One thing I wanted to clarify is these are added jobs, so they're not replacing existing jobs, but they're in addition. So here you can see that construction jobs were again on the lower end for job growth. On the next slide, we'll talk about the widening pool of potential job candidates and what we can do as HR practitioners. So this slide really shows the core of our presentation. We have discussed what is happening in post-COVID in labor economics. And we talked about how the labor composition is really changing. But now we're going to kind of transition and talk about and propose some ways to help bridge the gap between job seekers and job openings. So these areas that we're going to talk about now is revisiting approach to the classification system, revisiting job values, adjusting pay structures, and then rethinking the workplace concept. So we'll go into more detail on each of these on the next slides. So we want to change our skill framework and revisit our classification systems. So here we should consider updating job descriptions by looking at really how the work is done, evaluating what is needed to do the job. So here we want to ask ourselves if we're looking for the skills that we need now. So what do we mean by this? Let's dive into this a little deeper on the next slide to see what skills we might want to consider. So McKinsey & Company studied the types of skills that were needed in 2016 and how those compared to projected skills needed in 2030. And what they're projecting is a decrease in the physical and manual skills and basic cognitive skills, and an increase in the higher cognitive skills and social emotional skills. So this means skills like taking initiative, entrepreneurship, leadership, creativity, and imagination are projected to be in higher demand. Similarly, we were seeing that with a slide on the blue collar workforce decreasing, social changes occur and the world evolves and more technology is developed. We're seeing a transition away from these manual labor jobs and a shift into more jobs that require higher cognitive and emotional skills. So we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. Since we're transitioning into more cognitive and social skills needed, we as HR practitioners really have to look more broadly at classification design and systems. So recruiters have always looked for cognitive and social skills on some level, but we anticipate that recruiters will continue to take a broader view on the more cognitive and social skills. And this is really a domino effect we talked about earlier. The higher level cognitive skills are required, generally affects the job's value and pay. So we'll look at this a little more closely on the next slide as well. So one way to determine job value is to look at the external labor market. Let's take, for example, the hospitality industry. Many of those jobs are cyclical and repetitive and are not coming back. Some of the people who held those jobs are looking for higher level paying jobs. And the jobs themselves are changing too, and the classification needs to adapt accordingly. When we look at classification design and job values, we used to look at the job tasks as the core, where the job tasks would drive skills needed for the job. But now we're looking at the whole body of work, and part of this is looking at the cognitive, social, and emotional skills. So as you can see from this graph, the ratio of what skills are required is changing. And so recruiters are starting to focus more on social and emotional skills. So as I mentioned, this in turn affects the job's value or pay. And Igor will discuss this in more detail now.
Thank you, Michelle. And of course, as we look at job composition and job design differently because jobs evolve dramatically, we also have to acknowledge that external job worth and external evaluation of our jobs become more and more influential in our job worth studies. We're not suggesting that we have to abandon internal job evaluations. Many of the point factor systems or ranking or internal classification job evaluation systems are still very accurately describe value of the job. The issue is that the farther we go in this evolving economy and evolving job state, the more influence external valuation makes and has on our job classifications. And in many cases, internal and external valuation, they just don't connect. For example, we can use well-known point factor systems like FES or Hay studies and say that, just an example, that network administrator in our organization has higher number of points, higher point value, and therefore higher job worth than, let's say, network security analyst. So for that reason, we assign that job to the higher pay grade. And the network security analyst would be one grade or two grades below. Now, when then we go to external market valuation, we find that there's the opposite picture, that for some reason, at this point of time in this economy, network security is valued higher and paid, therefore, higher wages and salaries than network administration. Again, this is just an illustrative example. It may not be true, but the contradiction between internal and external values is more and more pronounced, and therefore, for that reason, we will see in some other slides that external valuation and market pricing become dominant force and dominant method used in job evaluation. When we revisit job values and structures based on all the changes in post-pandemic labor force and labor economics, there are some questions we need to ask. If jobs change their external values, how we accommodate or recalibrate their internal values in our organizations? And if we do, we would have to create kind of new construct, and this will require adjusting salaries and wages and revisit our pay structures, maybe regrade jobs from one grade to another, and to make sure that they reflect not only internal but also internal job worth. Of course, we need to then review our job evaluation system to make sure that they communicate with external job evaluation systems, with market pricing, and address inequities and compressions as we're doing this. So let's start with changing job values. If you look at the employer cost index, which is the indicator that shows increase in wages and salaries year over year, published by Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly, you can see here in this slide that jobs are not grow or fall or increase or decrease in value consistently. Some of them you can probably see such a volatility in sales and related jobs. You can see that it may go all the way up 6% growth per year and go down 1.5% decrease, in fact, in salaries and wages. When we look at this, I will just take a few examples to interpret this slide, but it will probably take much longer and you can probably review it later. But when you look at, let's say, service occupations, which is a gray line, you can see that it was consistently and continuously growing year over year. And in 2020, it actually reaches the highest point until it fell due to COVID. Now, we also know that if the average ECI, Employer Cost Index, reported by BLS, year over year was approximately 2.5 to 2.7%, then 6.5% or anything above 6% is pretty high increase. It doubles basically the national trend. And the thing about this is, first of all, I mean, we have to read and interpret these numbers correctly. We have to factor, for example, the during pandemic, the practice was to eliminate some of the jobs that we didn't need at that time, like leisure and hospitality. If your restaurant is closed, of course, the employees are either being put on furlough or laid off, or the job of being evaluated, eliminated. And statistically, when you eliminate lower paid jobs, on average, the job value increases. So that actually also played into this high increase in job values. You can also see that like nursing and residential care was continuously, gradually growing over time and producing around 3% or over 3% average increases. And vice versa with, let's say, yellow line of educational services. It was volatile and it was actually going down since pandemic. All this probably would be helpful for us to predict what kind of jobs we would need to focus in the future. And if we look at the next slide, again, we're still talking about employment cost index for wages and salaries. And when the easy way to understand that index as inflation of jobs would be, we compare this with ECI, with CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, main indicator of inflation of goods and services. So if CPI is growth year over year, increase of the prices for goods and services, ECI is increase and growth of wages and salaries. In many cases, we actually, some employers use for their pay increases CPI, Consumer Price Index, and say, well, if CPI is 3%, let's give our employees 3% increase. We call it cost of living adjustments. In other cases, employers use ECI, Employer Cost Index, and call it cost of wages. Now, for many years, we actually advocated that COLA, cost of living adjustment, may not be always the best tool for the organizations to track and move their employment ranges, job ranges, and pay increases for employees, because look at what's happening now. The average ECI in 2021 is projected to be 2.7, maybe 2.8%. And inflation index, CPI, is actually 5.5% as of September of 2021. Now, what are we going to do? Do we going to give everybody 5.5% increase? Because we did the COLA last year and we want to be consistent. The employee is going to say, hey, why not COLA again? And that would mean that we double the average increases in United States civilian workforce. You can see here actually on this slide the difference between 2021 and 2020, and you can see like nursing and residential care facilities moving to 4% CPI above the average increase versus 2020. You can also see healthcare and social assistant almost doubling in 2021 in terms of increases in wages and salaries versus 2020. There's also some losers here. Junior colleges and universities actually decrease in their ECI from 2.3% in 2020 to 0.8% in 2021. All this to be taken into consideration, that we still don't suggest that in colleges you only can make 0.8% pay increases to employees or adjust your pay structures by only 0.8%. Let's take a look actually what's going on in comparison from private to public sector. And as I explained in our introduction that I had both experience in private and public areas, and I kind of see the different practices in terms of compensation and classification, how different organizations, agencies, and companies approach those practices. You can see in the private industry, the average wages and salaries in 2020 grew 2.8%, while benefits, expenses or spendings of employers on employee benefits went up 2.1% versus 2019, 3% for wages and salaries and 1.9% for benefits. When you look at, and again, 2.8% in private industry is above the average of 2.6% for the entire labor force, civilian labor force in the United States. When we look at the same chart, but for state and local governments, we can see that in 2020, the increases in state and local governments were 1.8%, while on benefits, employers spend much more than in private industry. It's 3.1%. And it probably, some of it goes to some services that provided to employees in terms of healthcare or assistance or pension plans and so on and so forth. Smaller salaries are reflected, smaller increases in wages and salaries are also reflected in government agencies' pay structures. We will talk about this in the next slides, but now let's revisit job values. And again, the questions HR departments probably want to ask themselves at this point is, Michelle and I were discussing the changes in labor force and economics, and we would ask if we were a HR department, do we have difficulty to recruit and retain, and where? And I'm sure all HR departments do ask themselves these questions. But the following question would be, when was the last time your organization reviewed job values? And how do you set hiring wages? Can you afford bring all new job candidates anymore to minimum of the pay ranges or first step of your pay grade if you have step system in the government? Can you actually do that? And again, the time of flat fees, wages, fixed wages, or narrow ranges in compensation probably is gone, if not forever, that at least we won't see it for a long time, probably. If I can refer you back to history and to one of the historical fact, when Henry Ford in 1913 made an announcement that all factory workers on his factories will have increases by Monday, increases for their daily work. That was a fixed daily rate for everybody, regardless of performance. And that rate was $2.50 per day. That's what workers were making in Ford's plant in 1913. And Henry Ford announced, and since Monday, from Monday, those wages go up to $5 a day, 100% increase. Now, how did it affect a market valuation and other industries and other organizations and businesses and their wages and compensation practices? That was such a dramatic increase, and we don't think it had such a ripple effect, but it did affect the American economy for decades to come. But today, market plays more and more influence and higher role in compensation and classification design. So we need to constantly be looking at the labor market and make sure that there's no inequities, there's no compressions in our and that we align with the labor market. Otherwise, we just can't retain or recruit that labor force. So let's talk about evaluating jobs and pay structure design. In order to answer all those questions, how do we keep up with the labor market? We need to understand what job evaluation method first we use and why, and how to align job ranges with market ranges, regardless of our internal evaluation method. And what are building blocks of our pay structure and how we select pay strategy. So there are two major streams in, as you know, in job evaluation systems methods. One is quantitative, which the example would be a Hay plan or federal evaluation system or some other point factor system when you break jobs into compensable factor and you assign points to each compensable factor. And then you compute those points and each job will have point value. The higher the number of points, the larger the value or worth of this job. This is how we rank jobs inside of our organization. But there's also qualitative methods like ranking, like pair comparison, like classification, so on and so forth, that don't use point factor, don't use points actually, they just compare factors. And the paradox is that both quantitative and qualitative methods, in the end, after all the work that is done, have to go to market-driven methods, have to go to labor market research and see if our point factor, if our assignment of points are consistent with the market value of that job. Here's the table that actually shows the use of a job evaluation system in the United States. Most of the occupations and occupational groups, as you can see, rely on market pricing. 72% in executives, 66% of professional, 67% of administration, and so on and so forth. Only 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points using ranking. Only the second largest would be point factor system. And again, it would be second largest using an average 20% of the organization use point factor. But then let's not forget that point factor as part of the process has the final stage of market analysis, market comparison. How does it affect our pay structures? You can see here that the most commonly used pay structures are traditional, market-based. There's a new development, relatively new, probably few decades, called pure market pricing. I'll explain what it is in a moment. And of course, step structures and broadbands. Broadbands were very common and popular in the mid-century, and they have very wide spread from minimum to maximum, wide bandwidth. And they were used for some time by certain organizations, but they're proven to be costly, and they may create some inequities, and in some cases found to be, by some studies, not as effective as others. Now, step structures mostly used by government today. We really don't see any for-profit or even non-profit organization using step systems anymore. Traditional systems where you have like a fixed structure with pay grades, pay ranges for each pay grade, parameters, control points, minimum, midpoint, maximum, and of course separation between each pay grade, like we call midpoint separation. And the spread, as you can see, is anywhere in traditional system from 36 to 51%, from minimum to maximum. Whereas market-based system it's a blend. It's kind of use the same structure as traditional. It's a fixed system, but the jobs are assigned to pay grades based on the market values, on their market parameters. And of course, the ranges are anywhere from 46 to 65%, and the separations, the midpoint separations, typically anywhere from 10 to 20%. The pure market pricing, again, like I said, it's a relatively new development. It's actually when you don't need any structural approach. You just take a look at the labor market. You just say that, hey, this is the range for accountant, and that range is used for just one job for the accountant. And the ranges for each job, you will have market range, and they don't have to have consistent separation or bandwidth or have any kind of structural approach to that. So many successful organizations actually use that method. It's the only thing is that you have to constantly monitor the labor market and adjust your pay ranges for each job. What are the most commonly used methods in pay structure? As you can see, just like in job evaluation, market-based structures and traditional structure are the most commonly used in the United States labor force. 55% use market-based structures, create traditional structural approach, and assign jobs to pay grades based on their market external values. While doing this, organizations actually have to make sure that they do have some kind of guidelines, some kind of rule, the rule or pay philosophy. How do we compare to labor market? What do we compare? Actually, what control point? Let's say if you match the market, then your midpoint of your pay grade would be aligned with the market 50th percentile. Some organization can lag the market and build their pay structure based on that, or lead the market. And that, again, is a decision based on business structure, business objectives, organizational culture, and many other factors. Whatever we do, when we build pay structure, this is the dilemma we have in contemporary labor force and compensation practices. Let's say that this is our, in this orange or tan color, whatever this color is our company's range from minimum to maximum, and we have midpoint. And we have market range. You can see that the market range is wider in this case. So what do? First of all, we hire employees below the minimum of the market because our pay grade minimum is positioned below, and our maximum is way below market maximum. So what do? We can't actually bridge that variance just that easy. So what we do is we try to bridge it by moving our structure to align minimums so we can recruit. And once we did this, we also have to shift our midpoint. But then we see that we're still below the market. So we in midpoints and maximums. So in order to address that, what we do is we try to align midpoint. But then what happens, unless we change the bandwidth, the spread of our pay grade, now we have to pay more at the start. So we have labor costs that we didn't have to incur, because in the labor market, we could hire people and start job candidates at the lower wage. The only way is, in this case, to match not only the range, but also the bandwidth, the spread of that range. not only one control point, not only minimum or not only maximum, but all three of them, minimum, midpoint, and maximum. And in that case, we can say that, or we can be competitive and build a pay structure that will be aligned with the labor market. The last slide we have is to rethink a workspace concept. After, of course, COVID, the major thing that happened, the major trend that we can observe is we started working in hybrid workspaces. Some work at home, some work in coffee shops, some work in half time at home, and then they go to office and for some important meetings. But that trend happened, and it doesn't seem that it's going to scale back, even after COVID, even in post-COVID marketplace. McKinsey actually did the study, and they suggested that you can see on the chart on this exhibit on the left, you can see that this pre-COVID-19 bar, which is black, is the organization that majority, the most of the workforce, more than 80%, actually had to do the job in a traditional workspace in the office or in the factory or in the place of work where they used to be. And post-COVID, only 10% actually say that our entire workforce, or more than 80%, will be still coming to workspace, to designated work area. Only 10% versus 99%. Many organizations, and I was part of it, we were working on some of those policies. We're trying to institute remote work for decades, and the management and executive resisted that trend because they didn't think it would be effective. Now, COVID proved that it was tested, accepted across the country, and it actually produced savings on overhead. We actually have studies that give exact dollar amount, calculate exact dollar amount that employers save on space, on overhead, on productivity. It's actually showed that productivity was same or better. And of course, there is a reduction in geographic differentials, because if you work in Tucson, Arizona for Silicon Valley company, that Silicon Valley company doesn't have to pay Silicon Valley wages. They don't have to, no longer required to tie it to cost of living in San Francisco or San Mateo. So of course, some of the wages go down, some of the wages go up. I mean, it obviously increased some wages in Tucson, Arizona, because the potential to get the job outside of your hometown now is greater, and there's more job opportunities. That changes all the dynamics in compensation, and this is something organization and human resources, of course, need to take into consideration if they use those hybrid models. There are, of course, increased risk of turnover because there's more jobs, and possible decrease in engagement. That's what some employers already complain about or suggested. But the trend is there, and we don't think it's coming back all the way to what it was in pre-COVID labor force. We thought that we discussed some of the tools and some of the ideas how to widen pool of potential qualified candidates from classification, compensation, job evaluation, and job structure and pay structure design perspective. That will conclude our presentation, our webinar. Are there any questions for us?
So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I have sort of a question, and I was looking at your presentation of how the ranges are moving in alignment as organizations modify ranges. And I was wondering, I noticed that a lot of organizations will move up the bottom of the range, move up the bottom and the top of the range, right? But an individual employee is still where they are. So let's say I'm brought in at the 30th percentile of the range, and the range over the course of 3 years moves up by 10%, right? On both the bottom and the top. And I started at the 30th percentile, but now after 2 to 3 years, I'm near the minimum of that particular range.
Yeah.
How does that, do organizations, or how do you recommend that organizations deal with that particular issue and not have the perception of the employee feel like over time they're worth less to the organization based on where they fit in their range?
Well, this is, Jason, this is a very good question. And our participants almost will be thinking that we conspire, like we created this kind of discussion. And your question was, I'm glad that it was spontaneous and that you thought about this, because this is where all this presentation was going to, that you have to change, adjust your pay structures, classification, compensation system, because the bottom, the end goal is to assign a true market value to each job incumbent and each individual and each job candidate. With the ranges and the values of job changes, so does individual place or position within the range. When we calculate, in order to understand employees' position within the range, we calculate wage penetration, just what you were saying. You are in 30th percentile, or you're in 50th percentile. You penetrate 50% within that range. So you're right in the middle. All of a sudden, range changes, and your value in the labor market didn't change. You still very qualified.
Debatably, in today's labor market, your value increased in the labor market,
exactly,
but decreased within your own organization.
Exactly.
With respect to the range.
Exactly. So with that, once you move your pay structures and adjust and align them with, or redesign them, the next step, the end goal is to assign a true market value to each individual. I made this example with Henry Ford $5 per day wage with that in mind, because today each professional knows, like accountant with 10 years of experience, it knows exactly accountant his or her value in the labor market. And he or her would say, I have to be at the 50th percentile of the, or 60th percentile of the labor market, wherever it is. Now, all we're saying here in this presentation is your internal structure, are your internal valuation systems and classification systems in alignment with that market value. Because if not, your employee will never be satisfied, will never be, it's a retention issue. So yes, they have to move employees, and there's different ways to do that. And that probably is the separate conversation for another topic in a webinar.
Awesome. Well, I could geek out on questions regarding these types of things. I don't see any from the people that are attending. So being mindful of everyone's time, I wanted to thank Igor and Michelle for a fantastic presentation. For everybody that's on the webinar, please take a look at our site, cpshr.us. If you go to the resource library and search class and comp, this will come up. Or if you go to the about and then webinars, you'll see the previously recorded webinars in there as well. But thank you very much for the fantastic information, and appreciate the presentation from you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care,
Have a
everyone.
great rest of the day.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.